Hi, and welcome to Essential Reading, which is an occasional series on YouTube where we look at the absolute essential texts in any given literary trend. And today we're going to talk about Arthurian legend. And if you want to be really knowledgeable about all things King Arthur or just enjoy the story, what are the texts that you should read? Now, the King Arthur legend goes way back to the 6th century. Some of the earliest writings are by a monk known as Gildas. So people have been talking about this story for about a millennium and a half, but every different incarnation of the story tells you something about the culture and time that the story appeared. So there's no canonical version of the Arthur myth, although Mallory's Mort d'Arthur contains a lot of the factors that we associate with the Arthurian myth today. So without further ado, let's talk about the development of the story of King Arthur and his court and which books you might want to read if you're really interested in that area. So let's go back in the mists of time to Glastonbury Abbey in the medieval period, where supposedly, the monks found a grave inscribed with the words Hic iacet Arturus, quondam rexque futurus. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. Now, Glastonbury Abbey was basically the Disneyland of the medieval world. Pilgrimage was big business, and King Arthur was big business. People were into that story. And it was discovered that the lettering on this grave was absolutely nowhere near the lettering that would have been used in the 4th and 5th centuries, the time that King Arthur was purportedly alive. Newsflash, there was no King Arthur. He was not real. He may have been a composite figure made up of several hero leaders, but a lot of historians believe it's pure myth. What you can tell from this inscription, though, the idea of the once and future king, that Arthur will return again, that is an essentially Christian idea. It sort of reminds us of the idea of the second coming of Christ. Also, we have certain themes around the medieval period within the Arthurian myth, such as the Holy Grail, for example, which are also really quite Christian. So it's a very, very Christian world in Europe at the time. And the Arthurian story is a very Christian story. And you can see how that has evolved into things like the BBC's Merlin, where the Holy Grail becomes the cup of life and they try and take away a religious component. And sometimes superimpose an idea of Druidism and paganism, which isn't actually historically accurate, but they're associating Arthurian myth with the pre-Christian world, whereas in the medieval period, it was very much associated with the Christian world. So Arthur was at first not a king. In the earliest texts, he was a hero. So these are referred to as heroic texts. And within an Arthurian legend, we have heroic and romance texts. And the heroic texts were the ones that came first. And this Arthur was basically going about the business of defending the Britons against the Saxons in the 4th and 6th century. Now, his earliest appearances are in there's about 3 texts that sort of constitute very early writing on the Arthurian myth. The Annales Cambriae, which is sort of Welsh, sort of purported history and legend, Nennius's Historia Brittonum, and Gildas's writings. And Gildas was a 6th century monk. Now, where the story suddenly really took off and really captured the public imagination was when a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a rather fanciful work called Historia Regnum Britanniae, a history of the kings of Britain. Now, this was in essence written to butter up and flatter the Plantagenet regime, which hadn't been in power really that long. It was written around 1130 in the 1130s, and at that time King Stephen was on the throne. Now, Stephen had basically usurped the throne from his cousin Empress Matilda, who had been promised the throne by her father King Henry I whenever her brother died. But unfortunately, the nobility of that time were not really ready for a female leader, and so Stephen swooped in, took the throne, and a period of civil war ensued. And so in this work, the Historia Regnum Britanniae, Geoffrey and Monmouth is talking about these great kings of the past, starting off with Brutus, as in, Brutus and Julius Caesar. So Bruta gives us Britain. And this really bolsters the sort of male powers. It's shoring up Stephen's ideas, it could be argued. So influential a work in relation to Arthurian myth was Geoffrey of Monmouth's work that Arthurian myth is divided into pre and post Galfridian writing. Galfridus being Latin for Geoffrey. So what came before Geoffrey and what came after? Before Geoffrey, we see King Arthur as that kind of heroic warrior, coming from a pagan tradition of writing, something very similar to Beowulf. After Geoffrey, he is a king. And actually, it's really Geoffrey of Monmouth who introduces us to some key events and figures in the story that we're still familiar with today. For example, Uther Pendragon. And Pendragon, incidentally, is not a surname. It's an epithet, so it means Uther, the head of the dragon, describes his personality. We hear about Arthur's birth at Tintagel, which is brought about by skullduggery and the magic of Merlin. Merlin is introduced here, as is Guinevere and Excalibur, and also the final battle with Mordred. So a lot of those familiar elements are starting to come together in Geoffrey's text. Now, if that makes it sound like the Historia Regum Britanniae is an Arthurian text, actually you'd have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to find the bits that are related to Arthurian myth, but those are the parts of the story that really fired the public imagination. The 12th century French writer Chrétien de Troyes added another key figure, Lancelot. And he began writing about Arthur's court, not just about Arthur himself. So this added all these stories that could make the whole Arthurian world epic. So, for example, we get stories like Tristan and Isolde, where King Arthur is not a central figure, but it's all happening in his court. Arthurian legends basically trended throughout the later medieval period, but they actually died out in the Renaissance. And it wasn't until the 19th century that they became popularised again by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Think Lady of Shalott and Idylls of the King and Guinevere and Enid and all those slightly sentimentalised poems. Remember the romantic movement in English, which doesn't mean romantic as in Mills and Boon love stories, but romantic as in a focus on nature, a focus on radical politics. It made the medieval popular again rather than the classical. And so this resurgence in interest in Arthurian myth kind of comes out of that. And you don't just see it in the literature of the Victorian period, you see it in the artwork as well. Think of all those lovely like pre-Raphaelite paintings, John William Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott, for example. I mentioned before that we had heroic and romance traditions in Arthurian myth. So a romance is defined by Gowder College as a medieval narrative representing the adventures and values of the aristocracy. So there is this kind of code of conduct called chivalry, which knights and other sort of genteel characters are meant to follow. In the medieval romances, that is a key message and a key value, and that comes through in the Victorian writing as well. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, chivalry is the sense of honourable and courteous conduct expected of a knight, and was perhaps at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, and was strengthened by the Crusades, which led to the founding of the earliest orders of chivalry, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, known as the Hospitallers, and the Order of the Poor Knight of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, known as the Templars. Both originally devoted to the service of pilgrims in the Holy Land in the 14th and 15th centuries. The ideas of chivalry came to be associated increasingly with aristocratic display and public ceremony rather than service in the field. So this concept of chivalry you can very much see coming through to the literature of the time, especially Arthurian myth. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth's tales did not just light up Britain. They were pretty popular in France, and remember that the ruling family of England was French, had come from Norman roots via William of Normandy, William the Conqueror. So These French stories focused on the knights of the Round Table and characters like Lancelot, Galahad, Percival, Guinevere, and Gawain. Arthur is seen as a sort of old king, and he's sort of a wise but remote figure, and maybe slightly ineffectual in some of these stories. Now, the most famous French writer of Arthurian myth is undoubtedly Chrétien de Troyes, and he introduced the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere and the concept of the Holy Grail. Now remember, relic hunting and the value of relics was something very real at the time, so the Holy Grail takes something that people are actually interested in and sort of kicks it up a few notches. Back in Wales, where people were first talking about King Arthur, this romance Arthur started to replace the heroic warrior Arthur. Arthurian tales had originally been written as poetry, but they became prose around the year 1210, especially in the so-called Vulgate cycle, also known as the Lancelot Grail cycle. And it's written in Middle French, and it's a prose work. And it's in this work that we get the idea of Mordred being Arthur's son by his half-sister Morgause. Not Morgan Le Fay, but Morgause, a different figure. It was really the 1982 movie that conflated Morgan or Morgana and Morgause. Now, the biggest text that appeared in the later medieval period around the whole King Arthur story was Malory's Morte d'Arthur. And obviously that's a French title, and it owes quite a lot to the French cycles. It was printed in 1485, and it was actually one of the first books to be printed in England. In the Renaissance, scholars disputed the existence of King Arthur as a real person, and that led to a sort of fall from favour of Arthurian myth. People wanted to believe that King Arthur had actually been real. Also in the Renaissance, we get religious changes and shifting class structures, and so interest in chivalry and chivalrous tales and romance wanes quite a lot. And in fact, in 1634, the Morte d'Arthur was printed for the last time for nearly 200 years. Mind you, some Arthurian stories did survive, and the stories didn't completely go away. For example, the tale of Tom Thumb, which was an Arthurian story, remained popular as a fairy tale, and John Dryden wrote a masque called King Arthur. It was really, as I said before, the Victorians who reimagined Arthur, people like Tennyson and John William Waterhouse, and to a certain element Romanticism, which focused on the medieval and created a Gothic revival, recreated interest in the King Arthur story. In 1816, the Morte d'Arthur was reprinted, and as I say, it had been nearly 200 years since anyone had shown much interest. The Lady of Shalott was published in 1832, that poem by Tennyson that very much captures the sort of sentimentalised romantic image of the Arthurian myth. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and on either side the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. Now I can remember that from school. If you look it up, I probably got that wrong, but it's stuck in my memory. So famous is that poem. Tennyson also wrote a set of poems called Idylls of the King, and these retold the Arthurian story for the Victorian era. And it gives us Arthur as a flawed king and a flawed hero, and his flaws ultimately prevent him from creating a perfect kingdom, a perfect society. As well as the poems, of course, they were accompanied by some beautiful pre-Raphaelite paintings. Now, it wasn't just in England that there was a renewal of interest in King Arthur. In the USA, Sidney Lanier's The Boy's King Arthur, which was published in 1880, inspired Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which appeared in 1889. World War One did a lot of damage to the concept of chivalry and this idea of the noblesse oblige of the aristocracy. Sentimentalized notions of honour became unpopular and actually unpalatable after the carnage. But people still used the prism of Arthurian myth in the 20th century to look at, social and spiritual issues. One of my absolute favourite of these works is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. It is an amazing book. Please, 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 if you haven't already done so, read The Once and Future King. It's written in a way that is quite light and entertaining and far-fetched, but it actually has some pretty meaningful things to say about the experience of war in the 20th century. It was published in 1958. And in this work, Merlin is aging backwards through time. So he starts in the 20th century and then works his way to the medieval period, where he meets a little boy called Wart. And Wart is to grow up to become King Arthur. And you have this sort of dichotomy in the book between Wart, who is a lowly character in his household but has been very loved and has had this wonderful childhood, and then Lancelot, who has been raised with complete indifference and what that's done to his character. And Lancelot is not the romantic, heroic character, the knight in shining armour, that he might be elsewhere in Arthurian literature, although he has the potential to be, but he also has this streak of violence, a little bit of darkness in him. And so there are some interesting things to take out of The Once and Future King. It became the musical Camelot in around 1960, I believe, and also led to Disney's The Sword and the Stone. But to say that is to dumb it down a bit. Whilst it's light and easy to read, it also has some real points to make. Now, feminist retellings of the Arthurian myth, focusing particularly on the figure of Morgan Le Fay, were popularised by a book by Marion Zimmer Bradley called The Mists of Avalon that appeared in 1982. And that really took our perception of King Arthur tales in a complete other direction. In this novel, you have Morgan Le Fay, or she's known as Morgane in the novel, who is a pagan priestess worried that Christianity will completely oust her way of life. I personally find it anachronistic and intellectually simplistic, but people like it and say it's a pretty good read. Now, keeping on the theme of the character of Morgan Le Fay, who actually started off life in the earliest texts about 900 years ago as a benevolent figure, King Arthur's sister, who was one of the queens who bore him to Avalon after his death. It was really with, over time, and especially with Mallory, she became an antagonist. It's Morgan Le Fay who really whips up the situation between Lancelot and Guinevere into the crisis that it becomes, which leads to the Battle of Camlan. Although after her brother is killed, she is heartbroken. Recently, a lady called Sophie Keach, who really is very knowledgeable about Arthurian myth, has written a trilogy of books about Morgan Le Fay. Only the first two have been released, and I read them with great interest and really enjoyed them. The first is called Morgan Is My Name, and the second is Le Fay. So that's part of the sort of 21st century literary tradition of taking sort of traditionally male stories and telling them from the female perspective. If you think of, say, Madeline Miller's Circe or Anita Diamond's The Red Tent, does something quite similar. And so I can really recommend Morgan Is My Name. So if you're interested in reading Arthurian myth, that gives you quite a lot. But just to recap, the key texts I would go for are Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regnum Britanniae, Mallory's Mort to Arthur, Tennyson's Idylls of the King and the Lady of Shalott, and there's a lot of other Arthurian poetry by Tennyson that you might be interested in as well. He's got a great poem about Guinevere. The Once and Future King by T.H. White, The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, and the Morgan trilogy by Sophie Keach. Let me know if you can think of anything that I have excluded that you would regard as sort of essential reading in the comments. I hope you enjoy the books, and for those that are older texts out of copyright, remember you can get them for free on Project Gutenberg. So let me know any other literary trends you would like to discuss on this channel, and I will look forward to hearing your reading choices.